I used to believe that if I cried quietly enough, nobody would ever hear me. I was wrong. The rain started just after midnight. Not a violent storm. Just a steady rhythm against the windows of the old apartment building, soft enough to blend into the background of the city. I sat on the floor beside my bed, hugging my knees to my chest while the yellow glow of a single lamp filled the room. The apartment was small. One bedroom. One bathroom. Thin walls. Worn hardwood floors that creaked when I walked across them. It was not where I imagined I would be at 27 years old. But life had a way of ignoring plans. My name is Emma Carter, and 6 months earlier, I had been living a completely different life. A better one. At least that is what it looked like from the outside. Back then I had a beautiful house, a promising future, and people who claimed they would always be there for me. Then everything collapsed faster than I thought possible. Promises disappeared. Friends stopped calling. The life I had trusted vanished piece by piece until all that remained was this apartment and the silence that filled it every night. I spent most days pretending I was fine. I smiled at coworkers. I paid my bills. I answered questions with practiced confidence. But when darkness arrived and the city quieted, the truth always found me. That night was worse than usual. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe I was simply tired of carrying pain that nobody could see. Whatever the reason, the tears came before I could stop them. At first I covered my mouth. Then I buried my face against my arms. The sound escaped anyway. Small. Broken. Embarrassingly human. I hated crying. Not because it hurt. Because it made me feel weak. The rain continued tapping against the window while the clock beside my bed moved past midnight. 1 minute. Then another. Then another. I told myself to stop. I could not. Eventually, I leaned my head against the wall separating my apartment from the neighboring unit. The cool surface pressed against my forehead. I closed my eyes. Breathe in. Breathe out. Pretend tomorrow would be easier. Pretend everything would somehow make sense. On the other side of that wall, Vincent Moretti sat alone in his apartment. Of course, I did not know his name then. I did not know anything about the man living next door. I had only seen him once from a distance in the building lobby. Tall. Dark hair. Expensive coat. The kind of man people noticed immediately. The kind of man who seemed completely out of place in a building like this. At that exact moment, Vincent sat at a large dining table reviewing documents spread neatly before him. The room around him was quiet except for the rain and the occasional turning of a page. His attention remained focused until he heard something unusual. A sound. Faint. Almost hidden beneath the storm. He paused. Listened. Then heard it again. A woman crying. Soft. Heartbroken. Coming through the wall. Vincent lowered the document in his hand. The sound lasted only a few seconds before silence returned. Most people would have ignored it. Most people would have convinced themselves it was none of their business. Vincent could not. He stared toward the wall separating their apartments. Toward a stranger he had never met. Toward a voice carrying more sadness than words ever could. For reasons he could not explain. He found himself listening long after the crying stopped. And neither of us knew it yet, but that simple moment was about to change everything. The morning light filtered weakly through the closed blinds of my small apartment, dust motes floating lazily in the golden streaks of sunlight. I stood at the sink, rinsing a chipped mug while listening to the faint hum of the city waking outside, trying to shake off the heaviness from last night. My body ached from tension and restless sleep, and a soft breeze from the slightly open window brushed my hair against my forehead. I moved to the window, peering through the thin slats at the neighboring building, which looked empty and silent, unaware that just a wall away someone observed the world with a precision I could not yet comprehend. Vincent Moretti lived there, though I did not know his name. I had seen him only once in the lobby, a man in a sharp black coat, tall and controlled, moving with a presence that drew attention. Without effort. That morning I was oblivious to him, just like I had been to everything else that might have influenced my fragile life. I dressed slowly in muted tones, careful to avoid any confrontation with the mirror that reflected my tired face and red-rimmed eyes, remnants of the tears I could not stop the night before. Each movement was deliberate, as though I could measure control in every action to compensate for the chaos I had lost outside my walls. Down the hall, Vincent awoke with the memory of a faint sound lingering in his mind, the cry that had seeped through the wall. He had no way of knowing the source, yet it compelled him to listen, to consider the presence of another human in the building, someone who existed quietly yet profoundly in proximity to his own carefully constructed life. The contrast between our mornings could not have been more stark. I worried about rent, bills, and the precariousness of my existence while he considered contracts, arrangements, and the management of power that always required calculation. And yet, through the thin plaster that separated us, a bridge of emotion existed, invisible but potent. I moved to the kitchen table, tracing my fingers over the cold surface, staring at the scattered notes I had jotted in exhaustion, and wondered at the absurdity of my solitude. Outside, the city was alive, indifferent, carrying on while my life felt suspended, a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. Meanwhile, Vincent paused in his morning routine, noting the echoes of life around him, a subtle awareness of the rhythm of the building, and the possibility that someone nearby held fears and secrets as raw and immediate as his own careful calculations. He wondered, briefly, who this person might be, and why a simple sound could leave such an impression. In my apartment, I leaned against the table, resting my forehead on the cool wood, imagining that nothing and no one could reach me, unaware that every movement I made, every breath, every soft sigh, was already under quiet observation. Neither of us could know yet that this fragile, mundane morning would mark the first steps of a connection neither expected, a series of moments that would bridge the distance between two lives divided by walls, circumstance, and caution, yet destined to change in ways that neither could fully imagine. The sun climbed higher, spilling light into my room, highlighting the dust in the air, the soft folds of the blanket on the couch, and the quiet intensity of a day that promised nothing, yet silently poised everything for what was to come. The elevator door closed with a soft metallic click, and I pressed the button for my floor, gripping the strap of my bag with a small, uncertain hand. The ride was silent except for the gentle hum of the machinery and the distant echo of the city outside. I tried to focus on the numbers above the door, climbing one floor at a time, and for a moment, I imagined I was invisible, unnoticed, capable of retreating into my own private world where the weight of last night's tears could not follow me. Then the door opened and I stepped out into the narrow corridor of the apartment building, the beige walls muted, the faint smell of cleaning solution lingering. That's when I saw him for the first time. Vincent Moretti. I had no way of knowing his name, but I knew immediately that he was the man from the lobby, tall, dark coat, immaculately styled, presence sharp yet calm. He stood near the stairwell, reviewing something on a tablet, expression focused yet unhurried, eyes briefly flicking up to catch my glance. My heart stuttered, but I forced a polite smile and kept walking, pretending not to notice the subtle weight of his gaze. Each step echoed faintly on the linoleum floor, and I felt exposed, but at the same time strangely observed, like someone had already taken note of every small detail about me. I paused outside my door, fumbling with keys, and sensed that he had moved closer without a sound, a shadow beside the stairwell. The soft light from the ceiling created long angles, catching his jawline, the way his coat fell perfectly around his shoulders, the calm authority he exuded without any effort. I tried to focus on unlocking my door, on the faint squeak of the lock turning, but I could feel his attention lingering, quiet and deliberate, measuring, assessing, and perhaps protecting in a way I could not yet define. He did not speak, did not move overtly, and yet his presence was impossible to ignore. I slid the door open, stepped inside, and exhaled a breath I had been holding. The hallway was empty again, the normalcy of apartment life resuming its rhythm, but I knew he had noticed every small hesitation, every tight grip on my bag, the subtle tension of my shoulders, the faint redness around my eyes. Back in his apartment, Vincent lowered the tablet and leaned slightly against the counter, recalling the faint sounds from the night before, the echoes of a woman's cries traveling through the walls, and connecting them to the image of me he had just seen in the corridor. Something about the way I carried myself, the careful control over every movement, drew his attention, engaged a sense of protective awareness he could not ignore. I moved toward my bedroom, closed the door behind me, and for a moment allowed myself to breathe fully, unaware that in the apartment next door, someone had already begun piecing together the fragments of my life. He did not know my story, nor did I know his intentions, But for the first time in days, a quiet, invisible thread had been woven between us, subtle yet undeniable, and neither of us could foresee how the simplest, smallest connection, the briefest glance, the faintest sound, would start to change everything in ways neither of us could yet comprehend. 3 days passed before anything unusual happened again. Not dramatic, not life-changing, just a small moment that should have meant nothing. Yet somehow it stayed with me. I was returning home after a long shift at the bookstore where I worked. The evening sky above Chicago glowed with fading shades of orange and blue, and a cold wind pushed through the streets as people hurried toward restaurants, apartments, and train stations. By the time I reached my building, exhaustion settled heavily across my shoulders. I stepped into the lobby, nodding politely at the elderly manager behind the desk, then headed toward the elevator. The metal doors slid open. I stepped inside. Then a hand appeared between the closing doors. The elevator stopped. Vincent Moretti entered. The air immediately felt different. Not uncomfortable, just noticeable. Like standing beside a thunderstorm that had not decided whether it would arrive or pass by. He offered a small nod. I returned it. Silence followed. The elevator began moving upward. Floor 2. Floor 3. Floor 4. The soft hum of the machinery filled the space between us. I focused on the illuminated numbers above the door. Anything to avoid feeling awkward. Then my bag slipped from my shoulder. Papers spilled across the elevator floor. Great, I muttered under my breath. I crouched immediately, embarrassed. Before I could gather everything, another hand reached down. Vincent picked up several pages and handed them to me. Thank you, I said quietly. His eyes moved briefly across one of the papers before returning it. It was an overdue payment notice. My stomach tightened. I quickly slid it back into the folder. Pretend he did not see it. Pretend he did not notice anything. The elevator stopped on our floor. We stepped into the hallway together. I moved toward my apartment door while balancing the papers against my chest. That was when a photograph slipped free and drifted onto the floor. Neither of us reacted immediately. The image landed face up. A younger version of me stood beside an older woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. My mother. The photograph had been taken years ago on a summer afternoon before illness changed everything. Before hospitals. Before funerals. Before loneliness became a permanent part of my life. Vincent picked up the photograph carefully. For a brief moment his expression changed. Not curiosity. Recognition. As though he understood exactly why someone would carry an old picture until the edges became worn. He handed it back without comment. Thank you, I said again. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. His gaze lingered on the photograph for 1 second longer. Then he asked a simple question. Family. I looked down at the image. My mother. Something softened in his eyes. Very slightly. She looks kind. I swallowed hard. She was. Silence returned. Yet this silence felt different from the others. Less distant. Less guarded. The hallway lights cast warm reflections across the walls, while the city moved somewhere beyond the windows. For a moment, neither of us seemed eager to leave. Then Vincent gave a single nod. Good night, Emma. I froze. I had never told him my name. Before I could ask how he knew it, he turned and walked toward his apartment. Calm. Unhurried. Certain. A few seconds later, his door closed softly. I remained standing in the hallway holding the photograph against my chest. Confused. Curious. And strangely comforted. Because for the first time since moving into that building, someone had looked at my pain without looking away. And somehow, that simple conversation felt like the beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. The next morning, I woke up thinking about a man I barely knew. That realization alone should have worried me. Instead, it lingered quietly in the back of my mind while sunlight crept across the ceiling, and the city slowly came to life outside my window. I sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands. The photograph of my mother rested nearby. I kept replaying the conversation from the hallway. The way Vincent had looked at the picture. The way he had said she looks kind. Most people offered sympathy. Most people rushed to fill silence with advice. He had simply understood. Somehow that felt more meaningful. The day passed like most others. Work. Customers. Shelving books. smiling when necessary, pretending everything was normal. Yet when my shift ended, something unusual happened. My manager called me into her office. My stomach tightened immediately. Bad news had a habit of finding me. "Emma," she said, looking up from her desk. "I wanted to tell you personally before the new schedule goes out." I braced myself. She smiled. "You are getting promoted to assistant supervisor."
Ist her?
Certain I had misunderstood. "I am sorry." "What?" She laughed softly. "You earned it. The district office approved it this morning." My mind struggled to catch up. The promotion came with a raise, better hours, additional benefits. Exactly the kind of opportunity one had spent months hoping for. "Thank you," I managed. "I really do not know what to say." "You can start by accepting." I left the office feeling lighter than I had in a very long time. The cold evening air felt different somehow. The city lights seemed brighter. Even the crowded sidewalks looked less overwhelming. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. When I arrived home, another surprise waited for me. A small envelope rested against my apartment door. No stamp, no return address. Just my name written neatly across the front. Emma. I glanced down the hallway. Empty. Curious, I stepped inside and opened it. A simple card rested inside. No signature. No explanation. Just a short message. "Good things still happen to good people." I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. My chest tightened unexpectedly. It was such a small thing. Yet after months of disappointment, those words felt powerful. I carried the card into the kitchen and placed it beside my mother's photograph. Outside, darkness settled over the city. Rain began tapping softly against the windows again. Hours later, I sat reading on the couch when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Without thinking, I glanced through the peephole. Vincent stood outside his apartment door, loosening his tie after what looked like a long day. For a brief moment, he seemed less like the mysterious man next door, and more like someone carrying his own burdens. He paused as though sensing movement. Then he turned toward my door. Not directly, just enough. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth before he disappeared inside his apartment. I stepped back from the door slowly. My eyes drifted toward the envelope still resting on the kitchen counter, then toward the wall separating our apartments. A strange thought crossed my mind, one I immediately dismissed. Yet it refused to leave, because for the second time in a week life had become unexpectedly easier. And I could not stop wondering if the man who heard me crying through the wall had something to do with it. That evening, the building lights flickered faintly as I returned home carrying the small stack of newly organized papers and the envelope still resting on the kitchen counter from earlier in the day. The city outside had settled into its routine. Cars passing, distant conversations, the occasional siren weaving through the night air. I closed the apartment door behind me and leaned briefly against it, taking a deep breath as the warmth of my home contrasted with the chill beyond. I placed the papers and envelope carefully on the table and moved to the window, gazing out at the neighboring building. A single light glowed faintly on the opposite side, indicating that someone was awake. My thoughts drifted immediately to him, Vincent Moretti. I could not explain why I thought of him at all, yet the memory of his measured presence, the calm efficiency with which he had handled the photograph, and the way he seemed aware of things I had tried to hide, tugged at my curiosity. I made my way to the couch and settled into a comfortable chair, the envelope open beside me. The simple message, "Good things still happen to good people," repeated silently in my mind. There was something about the intentional anonymity of it, the quiet care embedded in those few words, that made my chest tighten with an unfamiliar warmth. I thought about the promotion, the solved problems, the subtle removal of small obstacles in my life, and a realization began to settle. Someone had orchestrated these changes without my knowledge, watching and acting from the shadows. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window slightly, drawing my attention again to the neighboring building. The glow of the light shifted as if someone had moved closer to the window. Vincent's silhouette appeared briefly, framed by the interior glow of his apartment. I could not tear my eyes away. The faintest smile touched his lips, and though he did not speak, the gesture carried a weight I could not name. It was a signal of awareness, of understanding, of a silent connection that neither of us had yet acknowledged aloud. My mind raced with questions I dared not voice, each one met with the quiet certainty of his composure. I returned to my seat, clutching the envelope and thinking about the fragility of my life, the string of small miracles that had brought relief, and the way he seemed to be involved without intrusion. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the city hummed softly outside, indifferent yet alive. I felt the tension of the day lift slightly, replaced by a tentative hope. Hope that someone somehow understood the weight of my burdens and chose to intervene carefully, deliberately, with respect for my space and my silence. That night, as I finally lay in bed, I could not sleep immediately. My thoughts circled around the faint light across the hall, the subtle ways life had been smoothed without my knowledge, and the man whose presence lingered quietly in my awareness. Somewhere behind that wall, Vincent was living his own evening, unaware that the smallest gestures, the simplest attention to detail, had begun to bridge a distance that seemed unmeasurable just days ago. And in the quiet, I realized that life could shift in ways completely unforeseen, that protection could arrive silently, and that the sound of empathy, even through a wall, could change everything in ways I was only beginning to understand. The power went out just after 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. One moment the apartment glowed with warm lamplight. The next, everything disappeared into darkness. I looked up from the book in my lap and blinked at the sudden silence that seemed to follow. Outside, the city remained alive, distant lights visible through the window, but our building had gone completely dark. A collective groan echoed faintly through the hallway as residents reacted to the outage. I stood carefully and searched for the flashlight I kept in a kitchen drawer. After a few minutes, I gave up and settled for the flashlight on my phone. The narrow beam illuminated the apartment in pale blue light. The silence felt different tonight. Heavy, thoughtful, almost expectant. After 20 minutes, the air inside the apartment began to feel stuffy. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Emergency lights cast a faint glow across the walls, creating long shadows that stretched toward the stairwell. I was not alone. Several doors had opened throughout the floor. Neighbors spoke quietly among themselves before gradually returning inside. Then, I saw him. Vincent stood near the end of the corridor, leaning casually against the wall with his hands in his coat pockets. Even beneath the dim emergency lights, he seemed completely composed. As if darkness affected everyone except him. His eyes found mine immediately. "Looks like we are both having a quiet evening interrupted," he said. The sound of his voice carried easily through the hallway. Calm, deep, familiar. I smiled despite myself. I guess the building decided we all needed a little adventure. A faint smile appeared. Small but genuine. We stood there for a moment while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Then Vincent glanced toward the stairwell. The rooftop has backup lighting. Better view than staring at apartment walls. I hesitated. Every reasonable part of me should have declined. Yet something about him made refusal feel unnecessary. Safe. So I nodded. All right. A few minutes later, we stood on the rooftop beneath a sky filled with clouds drifting across the moon. The city stretched endlessly around us. Thousands of lights. Countless windows. Lives unfolding in every direction. Cool wind tugged gently at my hair. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Eventually, Vincent looked toward the skyline. "You have been carrying something heavy for a long time." The words caught me off guard. I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because it was true. Is it that obvious? Only to people paying attention. I stared at the city below. The buildings blurred slightly as emotion tightened my throat. My mother died 3 years ago. The confession slipped out before I could stop it. Vincent remained silent. Listening. Not interrupting. Not offering solutions. Just listening. After that, everything started falling apart. Slowly at first. Then all at once. The wind moved through the rooftop. Somewhere below, a car horn echoed. People leave when life gets difficult, I continued quietly. I learned that the hard way. Vincent's gaze remained fixed on the skyline. Not everyone leaves. Something in the way he said it made me look at him. For the first time, I realized he understood loneliness. Better than he ever admitted. His expression carried traces of old scars that had nothing to do with appearances. Invisible scars. The kind life leaves behind. We stayed on that rooftop for nearly an hour talking about small things. Books. Chicago winters. Favorite places to escape when the world became overwhelming. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Yet when the building lights finally returned and we walked downstairs together, something had changed. The distance between strangers had disappeared. And for the first time since moving into that apartment building, I no longer felt alone. After the night on the rooftop, everything felt different. Not dramatically different. The city still woke to the same traffic. The bookstore still smelled like paper and coffee. The apartment building still creaked whenever the weather changed. Yet something inside me had shifted. For the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to coming home. Not because the apartment was special, because someone was there. Someone who understood silence. Someone who listened. The following week passed quietly. Vincent and I crossed paths often. Sometimes in the lobby. Sometimes in the hallway. Sometimes outside the building as the city moved around us. None of the conversations were particularly important. Yet each one seemed to matter. We talked about books. About architecture. About places we wanted to visit someday. Small pieces of ourselves exchanged slowly, carefully, like two people learning a language neither had spoken before. One evening, I arrived home carrying groceries and found Vincent sitting alone in the building courtyard. The autumn air carried the scent of rain, and golden leaves drifted across the pavement beneath the soft glow of outdoor lights. He looked up as I approached. "Long day?" he asked. I smiled. "How can you always tell?" A faint amusement appeared in his eyes. "You walk slower when you are tired." I laughed softly. The answer should have felt strange. Instead, it made something warm settle in my chest. He noticed things. Little things. The kind most people overlooked. I sat down on the bench beside him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The city skyline shimmered beyond the buildings, and distant traffic created a steady background rhythm. Then a thought surfaced. One that had been growing stronger for days. "Vincent." He turned toward me. "Yes." I hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I looked down at my hands. The promotion. The card. Some of the other things that happened recently. He remained silent. Waiting. "Were you involved?" The question lingered between us. The wind moved gently through the courtyard. Somewhere nearby, a gate closed softly. Vincent looked toward the skyline before returning his attention to me. His expression remained calm, controlled. Yet something deeper existed behind his eyes. "Why would you think that?" I almost laughed. "Because every time my life starts getting easier, you appear somewhere nearby." For the first time since meeting him, he looked genuinely caught off guard. Not alarmed, simply surprised. Then a small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That is quite a theory." "It is not a theory anymore." The smile faded slowly. Silence returned. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Finally, Vincent leaned back against the bench. "Emma." The way he said my name felt different tonight. Softer somehow. Some people spend their lives waiting for someone to help them. His gaze held mine steadily. Others help because they know what it feels like when nobody does. My heartbeat slowed, then quickened again. Because although he never answered the question directly, somehow he had answered everything. I stared at him for several seconds. The city lights reflected faintly in his eyes. And suddenly all the pieces fit together. The promotion. The message. The opportunities. The timing. Every road led back to him. Vincent did not deny it. He did not take credit either. That made the realization even more powerful. For months I had believed I was completely alone. Now I understood the truth. Someone had been paying attention long before I noticed. Someone had heard my pain through a wall and quietly decided it mattered. As the wind carried another wave of autumn leaves across the courtyard, I realized the biggest change was not the promotion or the easier days. It was trust. Because for the first time in a very long time, I trusted someone enough to believe they would stay. The first snow of the season arrived 2 weeks later. I woke to a world covered in white. The city softened beneath a blanket of fresh snow that reflected the pale morning light. From my apartment window, Chicago looked quieter than usual. Gentler. as though the entire city had decided to slow down for a day. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug and stood there for several minutes watching people leave footprints across the sidewalks below. Somewhere along the way, winter had arrived. And somehow so had peace. Not perfect peace. Life was still life. Bills still existed. Work still brought challenges. Some mornings still felt heavier than others. But the loneliness that once followed me everywhere had begun to disappear. That afternoon, I left work early because the snowstorm was becoming stronger. By the time I reached the apartment building, snowflakes swirled through the air beneath the streetlights, turning the entire block into something that looked almost unreal. I stepped inside, brushing snow from my coat. The lobby was quiet, warm, familiar. As I approached the elevator, I noticed someone standing near the window overlooking the street. Vincent. He turned when he heard my footsteps. His expression softened immediately. You made it home before the worst of it. I smiled. Sounds like you were worried. Maybe a little. The honesty surprised me. Seemed to surprise him too. We rode the elevator upstairs together. Neither of us felt the need to fill every silence anymore. Some people talk because silence makes them uncomfortable. With Vincent, silence felt safe. When the elevator reached our floor, neither of us moved immediately. The doors opened, then closed again. We both laughed. I think the elevator wants us to make a decision, I said. Vincent shook his head slightly. Apparently. The doors opened once more. This time we stepped into the hallway. Snow tapped softly against the nearby window. The building felt unusually quiet, almost peaceful. Vincent stopped outside his apartment. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who had quietly changed the direction of my life without asking for anything in return. The man who noticed what everyone else missed. The man who somehow understood broken pieces because he carried a few of his own. Can I ask you one final question? I said softly. He nodded. Of course. My heart beat faster. Why me? The question lingered between us. Snow drifted beyond the hallway window. The lights overhead cast a warm glow across the walls. Vincent lowered his gaze briefly before meeting mine again. For the first time since I met him, I saw complete honesty in his eyes. No distance. No misteri. Just truth. Because that night, he said quietly, I heard someone crying through a wall. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat. Vincent continued. Most people spend their lives pretending they cannot hear pain. It is easier that way. His voice remained calm, steady. I never learned how to do that. Tears blurred my vision. Not from sadness. Something else. Relief. Gratitude. Healing. Everything I had carried for so long suddenly felt lighter. Vincent stepped closer. Not enough to overwhelm the moment. Just enough to remind me I was no longer standing alone. Outside, snow continued falling across the city. Inside, the silence felt warmer than any words. And as I looked at the man who changed everything simply because he listened, I realized something my mother once told me years ago. Sometimes the people who save your life do not arrive with grand promises. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on the other side of a wall, and all they do is hear you when nobody else does.